The rest stop camera footage from Highway 93. Travelers who stopped along Highway 93 inches northwest Montana still mention a brief clip that circulated for a week. The footage reportedly showed a man walking out of frame near midnight while snow shifted across the empty lot. A sedan idled by the bathrooms and never moved again before dawn touched the pines. No one claimed ownership of the clip, and investigators never confirmed the original source or the download path. The image quality invited arguments rather than conclusions, and the winter air did nothing to settle them. The nearest town was Polson, and the rest stop sat above the lake on a rise that caught hard weather. State records describe the area as a recurring trouble point for visibility and minor collisions during early winter storms. The site had 2 cameras that faced the lot and a third that covered the vending alcove by the mapboard. Archived notes indicate the equipment came from a basic highway contract that rotated vendors every few years without fanfare. None of the paperwork settled where the clip first appeared, and none identified a technician who signed for backups. Some locals claimed a short video floated through a closed group chat used by road crews. The night in question was the second Friday of early December of 2019, according to dispatch logs from Lake County. Snow had begun by late afternoon, and the wind stacked it against the curbs in ridged lines. Plows ran the main lanes before midnight and left a narrow path through the lot for anyone who needed a break. A power blink left the building lights off for several minutes, and then the generator caught and held steady. The logs show a trooper performed a pass-through at 2320 and saw nothing worth marking on the form. The same logs show no calls from the payphone that evening despite the outage. 3 people can be placed there with enough confidence to matter without reaching beyond the available record. The first was Adam Riley, aged 39, a freight driver moving appliance boxes toward Kalispell for a morning offload. He pulled in for coffee and a quick look at his straps, then sat in the cab while the heater fought the cold. The second was Claire Dominguez, aged 32, a biology graduate from Missoula who drove north to meet a supervisor in Whitefish. She used the restroom and texted a roommate who later saved a screenshot for the county file from 2009. The third was Mark Ellison, aged 50, a state maintenance foreman traveling between stockyards to inspect salt sheds after the first storm. He reported iced hinges on a service gate and left a note inside the supply closet for the morning shift. Accounts diverge when the sedan appears in the frame because the angle creates a small blind spot on the driver door. Riley told a deputy that he saw taillights glow brighter twice, which suggested the driver shifted between gears without moving. That detail appears in state records and survives multiple retellings, even though no mechanical issue was later confirmed. Dominguez only recalled the idling sound and a figure by the mapboard who stood with hands in pockets against the wall. Ellison wrote in a maintenance message that a dark vehicle parked near the trash cans and never rolled forward to the pump. The logs show no pump on site, which means the line refers to the air hose near the curb. The footage itself begins at 23:38 based on a faded timestamp that never received formal validation from anyone. A figure moves from the vending alcove to the passenger side of the sedan with a slow step that never changes pace. Several frames flicker, and the camera catches snow streaks that cross the lens like scratches pulled from film. The figure leans toward the window, then steps away without opening the door and drifts toward the lot exit without lifting a hand. Headlights from a southbound pickup wash the scene for a second, and the figure is gone from the edge of the frame. The sedan continues to idle, and the clip ends without a clear reason for the cutoff. Investigators never confirmed who downloaded the clip or how it left the original storage cabinet inside the utility room. The vendor at the time maintained a small metal box with a lock that technicians opened during scheduled rotation dates. Archive notes describe a misplaced key during late autumn and a temporary latch that could be nudged with a thin blade. The technician who signed for December maintenance reportedly transferred in January and left no forwarding contact beyond a business mailbox. None of this establishes a leak or a deliberate removal, yet the timing continues to bother the county planner. Records conflict on whether the box was inspected before the storm cycle gained momentum. The sedan belonged to an adjunct instructor from Dillon who had borrowed the car from a colleague for a weekend trip. State records confirm the plate and the title while leaving the route vague between Missoula and the reservation boundary. The instructor, aged 42, taught evening classes and managed 2 short shifts at a bookstore to cover early winter bills. She was reportedly traveling to Columbia Falls to help a relative close a seasonal cabin before the deep freezes returned. A receipt from a bakery in Arley places her on the highway after dark with a bag of bread on the passenger seat. That bag appears in a still frame when the headlights glance across the interior during the flicker. Search efforts began the following morning when a wrecker driver reported the sedan idling without a driver and without hazard lights. A deputy arrived first, according to dispatch logs, and found footprints blown over by streaking snow that erased depth. The doors were locked and the keys sat in the center console with a phone buried under a cloth grocery bag. The trunk was empty and the glove box held registration papers and a folded map with a circle around Olney. Dogs brought to the scene struggled with drift lines and veered toward the tree line where wind piled snow into shoulders. Some locals claimed the scent pulled west toward the highway margin before breaking apart near the culvert. Investigators requested broader camera pulls from nearby businesses and workyards that face the corridor between the lake and the pass. Several owners cooperated and offered clips that showed plows and a few pickups and a tanker that turned north before midnight. None of the video showed the instructor on foot, and none revealed a second figure near the sedan during the crucial minutes. Records conflict on whether a white compact parked beyond the main lot for a short interval that might matter. An early report mentions a brief shape near the broken fence where Ellison noted the iced hinges on his form. That note sits in the county file from 2009 because older case folders absorbed later cases for space. In the weeks that followed, the rest stop became a point on a map inside a small conference room in Polson. State records show volunteers checked ditches and borrowed pits along Highway 93 from Jet to Rollins during the first clear days. A local pilot offered a slow pass along the lakeshore and reported nothing visible among the shards of ice near the reeds. Troopers returned at night to test reflections and shadow lines across the lot and compared them with the clip in question. They tried to stage a match with a volunteer who wore a wool coat and moved with the same slow step. The camera never produced the same blur, and the lighting refused to line up with the timestamp. A year later, a storm knocked power again, and the generator failed to start, which forced a temporary closure of the site. During that shutdown, workers replaced cables and found a second card wedged behind a plate that covered the main recorder. The card held partial files that opened badly and stopped before the important sequence began, which frustrated the deputy who carried them. A subcontract report states that earlier models sometimes created ghost indexes when power returned after momentary loss. The vendor suggested the card represented a half-written table and not a deliberate swap by anyone with a goal. Investigators never confirmed that explanation, and the working group chose not to issue a statement. Riley kept driving that corridor for another season and later told a reporter that the clip looked cleaner than the original screen. He believed that someone had trimmed noise, which would require access to software and knowledge that he did not possess. Dominguez finished her degree and left the state, though she kept a copy of the screenshot that showed the time. She said the clock on her phone did not match the timestamp, which raised a small question that no one answered. Ellison retired after the following winter and still maintains that a second vehicle idled near the trash cans for a moment. Investigators never confirmed any vehicle beyond the sedan that appears in the known frames. The instructor's family held a private service in Missoula during early spring of 2020 and kept attention away from the site. They worked with a mediator to settle loan questions and a quiet transfer of the borrowed car back to its owner. State records do not reveal friction between parties, and no civil filings came through the courthouse on Main Street. A single notice asked for information regarding the clip and offered a contact that later expired without follow-through. Some locals claimed a new video surfaced 2 winters later and showed the same figure walking at the edge of the lot. Investigators never confirmed the existence of a second clip and warned against reading too much into blurry frames. The rest stop today looks unchanged to passing drivers who slow on the grade and lean toward the lake when wind rises. The vending alcove still holds a faded map with thumbtack holes near the park boundary and an outdated campground icon. A new lock sits on the utility room, and a paper log hangs from a nail where technicians sign in pencil. Dispatch logs still mark minor collisions and a few stranded motorists when the plows fall behind at shift changes. Travelers step out for a minute and talk about the cold that climbs under sleeves before it settles in bones. The lot records what it can, while the cameras blink against snow that moves like static toward the edge of memory. The vanished miner of Nome Ridge. In early summer of 2019, a seasonal miner booked a bunk in Nome and walked the ridgeline above town alone. He carried a used metal detector, a battered pack, and a claim map folded into quarters inside a plastic sleeve. Several weeks later, searchers traced his tracks to whined, scraped gravel and a shallow cut marked by recent shovel bites. Locals reportedly still point to that slope when the north breeze lines the tundra grass and the sea turns gray. His name was Daniel Kerr, 48, a heavy equipment operator from Fairbanks who prospected small leases during seasonal breaks and layoffs. Archived notes kept by a borough clerk say he told the front desk he wanted 3 quiet weeks near Anvil Creek. He paid cash for a room 2 blocks from Front Street and asked for a ground floor unit facing the alley. The clerk wrote that he spoke calmly, carried no visible weapon, and wore rubber boots with dried clay seams. State records show Kerr renewed a limited entry claim the previous winter and mailed 2 small payments from a post office kiosk. The county file from 2009 includes a faded survey of the same bench, annotated with pencil arrows around a shallow tributary bend. Some locals claimed an older prospector had washed flakes there after a flood rearranged bars along the creek mouth. Investigators never confirmed whether Kerr knew those stories, though a library sign-out shows he borrowed 2 regional mining guides. On a Tuesday, dispatch logs recorded a weather advisory for dense coastal cloud and intermittent drizzle, with ceiling low and visibility variable. A taxi receipt in his room lists a drop at the Dome Creek pullout just before noon, with gear loaded in careful stages. A store owner later told troopers he sold Kerr fuel mix, replacement hose, and a handheld radio that could scan aviation traffic. None of those items were recovered at the site where his footprints ended among scattered cobbles and straw-colored sedge. The first person to sound an alarm was Lena White, 36, a clerk who managed checkouts and kept the lodge keyboard. She reportedly noticed his key still hanging late Thursday, then again Friday morning, with bedsheets unwrinkled and towels folded inside the rack. Her archived notes mention 2 missed conversations about a package and a quiet guest who nodded often but avoided long exchanges. She called the non-emergency line and asked whether a welfare check made sense, then waited while staff inspected the empty room. Deputy Mark Oden, 41, flew in from Kotzebue to assist troopers with a grid search once a formal report was filed. He interviewed White, the taxi driver, and a maintenance worker who remembered helping Kerr carry a small pump to the curb. Oden later described the man as methodical and polite, with a list on notebook paper and a preference for working alone. He also noted conflicting accounts of departure time and load weight, details which investigators never reconciled despite repeated calls and follow-up visits. A team walked the ridge north of town and found shovel marks, a cleared path through dwarf willow, and boot prints with broad, shallow tread. The prints crossed a frost scar, skirted a hollow with pooled meltwater, and paused near a rust-stained boulder shaped like a wedge. A torn glove finger lay beside small pebbles sorted into a checkered sample tray, arranged as if awaiting a short return. Beyond that point, the ground turned hard, mixed with stones polished by freeze and thaw, and the pattern thinned into scuffs. Searchers followed a faint line downslope where wind had planed the surface smooth and left only darker grit between sparse lichens. A wide arc of boot marks then reappeared beside a patched tarp weighted with rocks, with cup rings and a foil packet lying nearby. Troopers collected the items and photographed a shallow trench with damp sides that suggested recent work before weather closed again. Investigators never confirmed whether the trench held any payable material, since it had partly slumped and pooled under the light rain. Reports from that week document 3 helicopter passes and 2 dog teams that worked in widening circles along gullies cut by melt streams. One handler mentioned scented trace near an abandoned culvert where snow lingered beneath brush despite warm air and steady coastal light. Another handler disagreed and wrote that the dogs were reacting to old human routes left by hikers and berry pickers in previous seasons. Records conflict over how long the team stayed in the highest zone, since fog reportedly rolled over the ridge each afternoon. Back in town, Odin checked cameras along Front Street and a service station where Kerr had bought coffee and fuel in a plastic can. Footage shows him scanning a folded map, speaking briefly with a fisherman, and noting something on a receipt before stepping into the parking lot. The fisherman later recalled a curious question about river levels and an interest in outflow timing when coastal winds pushed against freshwater. Investigators never confirmed whether that conversation influenced Kerr's route choice, though the creek mouth was not part of the official grid. A second search concentrated on drainage cuts south of the ridge where meltwater gathered in shallow slots that deepened toward muskeg and scattered pools. Volunteer notes describe thin ice inside shaded pockets, boot sinking to ankle depth, and a rhythmic clink from stones shifting underfoot. One volunteer reportedly found a strip of duct tape with a partial thumbprint that matched nothing in available files. Another found a snack wrapper that matched lodge vending stock, though state records say the batch code was common in several towns. As days passed, a working theory formed that Kerr may have backtracked unseen and taken a lower traverse when fog reduced visibility. That idea fit with the arc-shaped prints and the trench location, as if he wanted to reach his tarp without climbing again. It did not explain the missing pump, the radio, or the hose, which should have been bulky enough to impede movement. Investigators never confirmed whether a second cache existed farther down the slope, despite repeated sweeps and systematic probing of shallow depressions. A guide who knew the hill said a snow machine trail sometimes hardened into a deceptive ribbon that drew walkers toward an older cut. Some locals claimed that cut ended abruptly at a short headwall where loose gravel slid under light steps and carried people sideways. The guide's statement appears in archived notes, along with a sketch of the headwall and an arrow pointing toward a low bench. Records conflict on whether that bench was searched with poles or only scanned from above while fog drifted through the notch. Dispatch logs capture a week of calls from relatives and coworkers who described Kerr as steady, frugal, and rarely prone to risk. A union steward from Fairbanks said he never drank on shift and disliked crowds, preferring quiet cabins where he could read old manuals. A former foreman reportedly remembered a habit of marking bolts with lacquer to track vibration and a pocket notebook filled with measurements. None of those details offered a clear reason for a wrong step, a sudden detour, or a decision to leave equipment behind. During a final sweep, searchers found a shallow imprint shaped like a knee beside a tangle of willow pulled up by the roots. A few inches away, a smear of damp soil crossed a rock face and ended in grains pressed into a pattern like fabric. Photographs show no blood and no obvious shoe print, only disturbed grit and a thread that matched the torn glove finger. Investigators never confirmed whether the marks indicated a stumble, since wind picked up overnight and sanded the surface into a uniform crust. In late summer, the case file grew thin as weather improved and seasonal crews rotated home, leaving notes and maps in labeled folders. A short memorandum proposes that Kerr intended to sample at 3 points along a side channel where the creek bent around a low rise. Another memorandum argues he likely aimed for the mouth to watch conditions during a falling tide that could concentrate heavier grains near cobble bars. Records conflict on estimated timeframes, since the taxi drop was imprecise and cloud patterns disrupted any meaningful shadow analysis. White kept a copy of the missing poster taped near the keyboard and wrote dates beside calls that asked the same questions. She reportedly told a visiting brother that the room stayed quiet for weeks, though the alley sometimes carried diesel scent after midnight. Her notebook ends with a line about returning a deposit and boxing 3 shirts for storage behind the desk with other unclaimed items. Investigators never confirmed whether a family member retrieved the box, since shipping records list only a surname and illegible initials. In autumn, a hunter spotted a rectangle of blue fabric near frost, stunted spruce, and radioed coordinates before weather closed again over the hills. A team hiked the bearing and found only a faded tarp shard, a snapped grommet, and marks from fox tracks in soft ground. The shard color matched nothing cataloged in evidence, and the grommet style differed from the tarp photographed at the trench site. State records list that lead as inconclusive and recommend renewed searches when spring snow recedes and the ground unlocks along the gullies. Years later, the ridge still draws walkers on long evenings when the light stretches and the sea reflects a dull metallic band. Some locals claimed the miner's cache lies near an old drift where meltwater vanishes into gravel and reappears below a low natural sill. Others point toward the head wall and say the bench gave way in thaw, swallowing a footprint and smoothing everything into wind-polished stone. Investigators never confirmed any of those theories, and the county file from 2009 remains a caution about incomplete ground. The story ends without resolution beyond the paper trail, a set of maps, and careful handwriting that measured days and minor purchases. Dispatch logs, state records, and archived notes describe a quiet man who planned small tasks and walked uphill before fog settled again. The ridge faces the sea and the town lights, and its gravel shifts each season when freeze and thaw pull stones apart. Kerr's name remains on a page that lodges between tabs, and the ridge keeps its distances when the wind crosses gently. The woman who disappeared near Carver's Gap. Travelers who stopped at the high pullouts near Carver's Gap reported a woman who waved once, then walked into thin spruce. The trail ran along the bald, where wind hit with steady force from the Tennessee side. Lights stayed flat and cold despite late afternoon, and the ridgeline carried radio traffic from both counties. No one noted a plate because the parking area mixed hikers and locals without clear lines. The first call reached dispatch just before sunset, according to logs released later. Her name in the county file from 2009 matched a teacher who had moved between Carter and Avery over several years. She was 38 and worked part-time as a substitute while picking up seasonal museum hours in Johnson City. Friends said she came for the rhododendron bloom and stayed for the quiet above the state line. She reportedly carried a cheap handheld map and a stainless bottle marked with blue tape. Investigators never confirmed whether she owned a reliable compass, despite several receipts found in storage. The last certain sighting placed her near the wooden post where the Appalachian Trail heads north across the grass. A retired lineman named Carl said she asked about a side path that cut toward Round Bald before the weather turned. He described a calm voice and a careful walker who checked the sky twice and tightened her jacket sleeves. His watch read 4:30 by his account, and his memory stayed fixed on the sound of traffic below. Some locals claimed Carl changed the time later, which state records do not fully address. Dispatch logs mark a second report from a couple who parked beside a dented sedan with faded county stickers. They watched a woman stand near the information board and fold a copy of a trail brochure into a narrow strip. The man recalled her glancing at a silver pickup with an aftermarket light bar, then stepping away without hesitation. The woman recalled a slight limp that appeared only on the downhill portion near the first switchback. Records conflict on whether those statements were taken the same night or days later. Rain moved across Roan High Knob after dark, and patrols split between the paved lot and the forest roads. A ranger from the North Carolina side coordinated with a deputy from the Tennessee side using a shared radio channel. Volunteer searchers gathered near Carver's Gap just after midnight and walked grid lines under steady drizzle and shallow fog. They found boot marks that matched her size near a side trail where moss hid pooled water. Investigators never confirmed those impressions because runoff smeared edges before a cast could cure. Archived notes mention a lightweight day pack found under low branches around a quarter-mile from the main path. Inside were snack wrappers and a folded paper with a grocery list and a museum shift date. A phone sat in the outer pocket with a drained battery and a hair elastic wrapped twice around it. The screen held shallow scratches but no cracks, and the case showed a faded tourist sticker. Technicians pulled the card and recovered brief texts that ended earlier than the last reported sighting. Avery County reports list two unconfirmed leads involving a silver pickup seen idling near the pullout before rain. One hiker said the truck crept past the lot twice, which he found strange given poor visibility and slick pavement. Another hiker said the driver leaned forward and checked the mirror often while the engine surged at irregular intervals. Investigators never confirmed whether the pickup belonged to a local contractor who worked on fences near the highway. Records conflict on the license digits and the description of a sticker behind the rear glass. State records show a previous call involving the same teacher on Roan Mountain during early spring of 2019. She reportedly got turned around in sudden fog near Grassy Ridge and waited beside a cairn until voices approached. The party who found her said she stayed calm and kept talking about frost hollows and bird calls to stay oriented. An incident note described firm boots and a careful pace with brakes at regular intervals despite dropping temperature. Investigators never confirmed whether that episode affected her later planning or gear choices before June. In the week after the disappearance, family and colleagues organized small teams and checked shelters to the north. A museum co-worker carried printouts and asked pieced questions at hostels and gas stations between Elizabethton and Banner Elk. Several people remembered her spending coins on coffee and a pastry at a market near Roan Mountain State Park. Others insisted they saw someone else with similar hair and a similar jacket, which complicated the running timeline. The county file from 2009 contains those notes without a firm ruling on identity. A storm knocked power lines across the ridge and slowed organized searching while crews worked along the highway shoulders. Helicopter support reportedly stood by until wind readings dropped into a safer band above the open balds. Heat signatures came and went as fog shifted across gullies and pooled in low draws between thick spruce. Teams marked possible tracks that crossed and recrossed animal prints near a wet seep where runoff gathered. Investigators never confirmed a single continuous line that matched her boots from the parking area. Weeks later, a trail runner found a stainless bottle wedged under a root beside a shallow step. Blue tape clung to the metal, and a fingerprint technician lifted partials that matched previous samples from her apartment. The cap showed light grit and a torn gasket, which might explain a sweet smell noted by two searchers. Some locals claim the bottle had not been there during early sweeps, which raised questions about movement after rain. Records conflict on when the site was first photographed and tagged for follow-up. The apartment in Johnson City held careful stacks of notebooks and a shoebox filled with admission stickers. One notebook mentioned a plan to walk the balds alone to map views for a lesson about settlement routes. Another page listed bus times and an alternate ride from a coworker whose statement later changed on 2 points. The coworker first said she offered a ride to the Gap, then said she offered a pickup from the Gap. Investigators never confirmed either offer, which left timing gaps across the late afternoon window. Bank records show a small withdrawal that morning and no further activity after the day of the hike. A library card saw used 2 days earlier for field guides that matched the notes found near the day pack. A phone account tied to a prepaid plan rolled over minutes on schedule without manual action from family. Technicians found no logins after the last tower handshake near the state line on the ridge. Dispatch logs carry that timestamp and mark it as the final verified ping. A rumor formed around an old farm road that drops toward a creek where anglers leave crushed cans. A property owner told deputies about a woman who waved once near a locked gate before stepping into Laurel. He could not fix the date and changed the season at least twice during follow-up interviews. His dog growled at the brush that evening, and he found cords of stacked wood disturbed along the fence. Investigators never confirmed the account, and state records caution that memory shifted after news coverage. Later that summer, a faded sedan matching the parking lot vehicle was towed from a private lot near Elk Park. A shop owner said the driver left it overnight and never returned to settle a quoted repair. The owner thought the driver was male based on height and a cap pulled low across the brow. The tag returned to a different county, and paperwork took time because of mismatched mailing records. Archive notes say the lead produced no direct link to the missing teacher despite initial excitement. By fall, snow brushed the high grass, and searchers changed tactics to check drainages for winter evidence. Teams followed game trails where leaves bridged small streams and gusts erased prints within minutes. A jacket scrap turned up near a low snag, but color comparisons did not match clothing in photographs. A volunteer insisted the fabric felt similar to a liner she wore during spring trips on the same ridge. Investigators never confirmed the match, and records conflict on whether the sample was cataloged correctly. The museum held a small gathering where colleagues read notes about her lectures on birds and trade routes across the mountains. A student recalled her steady pace during a field trip and a habit of counting steps between viewpoints. Another student remembered a hesitant smile that appeared when someone mentioned weather reports and trail etiquette near fragile plants. Some locals claimed she had hinted at moving away, which her sister denied in interviews with a regional reporter. The county file from 2009 keeps both statements without comment on reliability. Winter closed the high road at intervals and ice grew along shaded cuts where plows could not hold traction. Crews marked fallen limbs and flagged slick corners, while visitors stayed lower in the valley towns. The case slipped from headlines but stayed in quarterly summaries prepared for both county commissions. Detectives traded notes about similar disappearances along the border where ridges tangle and lines divide jurisdiction. Investigators never confirmed meaningful overlap beyond weather patterns and occasional vehicle descriptions. In spring, a new ranger reviewed the folder and walked the first 3 miles north at dawn. He carried the printed dispatch logs and paused where the bale wire fence dips near a wet meadow. He noted how sound traveled along the bald and how voices blended with trucks grinding up the grade. A sudden shift in cloud shadow hid the post where the trail turns and the path narrowed near wind-stunted trees. His memo suggested a simple misturn compounded by weather and fatigue without clear evidence of intent. Years have not settled the case, and no court file closes the matter with certainty. Reportedly, a hiker sometimes meets a man who still repeats the time and the steps and the exact wind. He stands by the wooden post and points where the grass folds over and the path looks wider than it is. Some locals claim she walked out on a different day and left by a service road near the towers. Investigators never confirmed that ending, and records conflict enough to keep the question alive near Carver's Gap. The boy missing after the Anchorage power outage. Neighbors in South Addition remember the night the streetlights failed and the block turned to quiet shapes against Cook Inlet. A rolling outage moved across Anchorage after sunset, reportedly tied to an equipment fault at a substation near Tudor. Within that dark window, a 12-year-old boy left a duplex stairwell and was not seen returning by anyone nearby. The disappearance was recorded in dispatch logs as a welfare check that escalated when the caller could not reach family members. Investigators never confirmed the exact minute he stepped off the landing, and surviving records conflict on the sequence that followed. The boy was named Connor Price, age 12, a 6th grader whose mother worked nights as a certified nursing assistant. She was 39, employed at a facility near Lake Otis, and she left home before the outage reached the neighborhood. Her brother, age 34, an auto parts clerk, reportedly checked on Connor after dinner and found him watching storm updates. The uncle told officers he planned a quick drive toward Midtown for batteries, then doubled back when the traffic signals died. State records list his return time as approximate, and some locals claimed they saw the car pass once without stopping. The second person in the case file is Michael Reese, age 47, a floor technician assigned to overnight cleaning at a public office. He rented a ground floor unit in the same building, and he told officers he met the boy a handful of times. Reese said he heard a door close during the outage and looked through a peephole toward the landing. The hallway was dark, the emergency light flickering, and a shoe squeaked once on painted concrete. Archived notes say Reese could not identify whose steps he heard, and investigators never confirmed whether the sound preceded any exterior movement. The third person is Officer Lena Garvey, age 31, the first uniformed responder to sign the initial incident number that evening. She arrived after the lights returned for 2 minutes, then went down again as if the circuit tripped under load. Garvey walked the alley with a flashlight and found a bicycle leaned beside a trash enclosure behind the laundry room. The bicycle reportedly belonged to Connor, though the county file from 2009 notes the registration sticker was unreadable under winter grime. Records conflict over whether the seat height matched his last measurement, and investigators never confirmed if another child borrowed the bike earlier. Dispatch logs show multiple calls about power fluctuations and elevator alarms during the same half hour across adjacent blocks. A maintenance crew radioed a transformer smell near the corner convenience store, then lost contact when their handhelds failed inside a cinder block stairwell. An outage map captured by a local blogger shows a blotch along 8th Avenue, shaded deeper where circuits overlapped across feeders. The image circulated widely that week, and some locals claimed it proved a deliberate shutdown rather than a fault. Investigators never confirmed the blogger's data source, and state records cautioned that crowd screenshots often distort the real switching boundaries. According to the mother's statement, Connor stayed home with a list on the fridge and reminders about homework and the hallway light. She took the bus toward Lake Otis before sunset and called once from the break room during the first reported flicker. The call dropped after a greeting, and she told detectives the silence felt routine during a storm watch. She tried again on her next break and reached voicemail, then contacted her brother, who said he would drive back immediately. Dispatch logs note her third call at shift change, when she reported her nephew missing and asked for a unit to check the duplex. When Garvey stepped inside, the apartment air was cool and smelled like wet socks and an open box of detergent. A pot of macaroni sat crusted on the stove, and a pencil lay under worksheets spread across the table. The window looked toward a utility pole where a crossarm leaned, reportedly cracked by wind during a squall that crossed the water earlier. Garvey noted a jacket missing from hooks by the door and found boots damp with slush left in the corner. The county file from 2009 emphasizes that damp boots were common that month, and investigators never confirmed whether Connor owned another pair. Anchorage police coordinated with utility crews who were moving along feeders to test for faults after repeated trips under load. A crew chief told officers the substation protection had isolated a bad run and that service would stabilize after switching. The crew chief also mentioned a brief arc recorded on supervisory screens around the time neighbors reported the boy leaving. Archived notes capture his phrasing carefully, and state records remind readers that arcs happen often during winter switching. Some locals claimed the arc aligned with the alley and suggested an electrical scare might have drawn the boy outside, though investigators never confirmed that scenario. A security camera at the convenience store faced the corner, then turned off when the outage rolled across that grid square. The owner found corrupted files on the recorder, reportedly caused by repeated starts that exceeded the small battery's tolerance. 2 frames remained legible, showing a figure with a hood stepping past stacked bags of ice and pausing at the curb. The height and jacket length were consistent with a small teenager, though shadows widened the outline against the snow. Records conflict on whether the hood carried a stitched logo, and investigators never confirmed a clear facial image from those frames. Searchers walked the Chester Creek Trail the next morning, moving slowly where tire ruts froze into ridges beside the path. A volunteer found a glove near a bench, blue knit with stretched wrist seams and a smudge of grit on 2 fingers. The mother said Connor owned gloves like that, then grew uncertain when shown a photo that made the knit look darker. The item entered evidence with a notation about uncertain ownership and environmental contamination from overnight frost. Dispatch logs record a second glove reported near the lagoon, then withdrawn when the caller failed to answer a callback, and investigators never confirmed its existence. Is less than hash-own. 0 hash is greater than. Reese told detectives he took out trash during the outage and watched headlights scatter on wet pavement along the alley mouth. He believed he saw 2 silhouettes at the corner, one short and one taller, moving quickly toward a bus stop without speaking. The taller figure held a bag that knocked against a thigh, and the smaller shape glanced back once, then ducked behind a plow berm. Reese admitted uncertainty about distance because a neighbor's generator vibrated metal stairs, blurring his focus during the observation. Archive notes repeat that admission twice, and state records mark the sighting as uncorroborated, though the timing matched the outage window closely. The uncle described his errand as routine, a circuit of two stores that usually carried batteries and a small propane canister. He said traffic stalled along C Street because signals blinked, then went dark, and drivers edged through with horn taps. He circled once near the duplex, saw the stairwell light flash, and assumed the unit would stabilize after the next switch. When he reached the door, he called the boy's name and found quiet rooms and a page of homework under a phone. Records conflict over whether he entered the building on his first pass, and investigators never confirmed his drive path using available cameras. During interviews, classmates mentioned a plan for sledding after the next snowfall, with a meeting point near a small park in Midtown. One friend reportedly texted about a borrowed sled and a repaired headlamp that could run on backup batteries. The phone recovered from the table contained an unfinished reply that referenced the headlamp but not the meeting point specifically. The county file from 2009 highlights the gap between the unfinished reply and the last status report recorded by the device. Investigators never confirmed whether the boy intended to leave for that plan during the outage, though some locals claimed they heard excited voices outdoors. Weather logs show gusts along the inlet that lifted salty spray and glazed sidewalks through brief freezing drizzle. Utility crews reported linemen slipping on ladders and pausing work to salt rails at a substation gate. A transit driver radioed about passengers crowding on board while streetlights remained dark, then asked dispatch for guidance about unsupervised minors. That message appears in dispatch logs 3 minutes after the first welfare check, placing both threads inside the same operational window. Investigators never confirmed whether the driver passed the boy's block, and state records refrain from connecting those events beyond proximity and shared conditions. A resident 2 buildings east kept a paper notebook for power blinks because appliances sometimes failed during voltage dips. He wrote times in blocky numbers and kept tallies for each blink counted in the kitchen with a candle burning nearby. His notes include a scribble labeled child voice, then a short arrow toward the alley where the bicycle was recovered earlier. Archived notes indicate the resident could not recall whether the voice came before or after the second deep blackout. The county file from 2009 cautions that manual notations during outages are notoriously fuzzy, and investigators never confirmed the accuracy of the marks. By the second day, snow hardened into ruts and footprints lost shape under municipal plow passes along the trail network. A drone team flew grids above the greenbelt, then battled interference near transmission lines that hummed as power stabilized across feeders. The team reported brief signal jitter along one corridor that paralleled the alley and turned toward a drainage culvert under the avenue. Some locals claimed the jitter implied an object inside the culvert, though the pilot later tested and reproduced interference near similar lines. Investigators never confirmed any anomaly beyond routine radio noise, and state records treat the flight logs as inconclusive but properly archived. Several tips arrived from neighborhoods west of Minnesota Drive, where residents reported a boy matching Connor's height near a bus kiosk. One caller described a child in a gray jacket asking about a route to Turnagain, then walking away when a bus arrived. Another caller insisted the boy rode north toward a stop near Northern Lights, carrying a bag shaped like a folded sled. The uncle told officers Connor did not own a folding sled, then paused and said a friend might have loaned one earlier. Records conflict on whether that friend was contacted promptly, and investigators never confirmed the kiosk sightings beyond uncollected footprints on packed snow. On the third day, the mother returned to the duplex with an officer and found a faint shoe mark on the stairwell landing. The print was partial, smudged by slush, and measured close to the size the boy wore during the previous winter. A second print overlapped at an angle that suggested a quick turn toward the alley door rather than the interior hallway. Photographs entered the county file from 2009 show grainy edges and flash reflections from chipped paint across the riser. Some locals claim the prints proved a rushed exit, though investigators never confirmed gate direction from marks that degraded under repeated entries. A week later, state records show the case coded for continuing investigation with periodic checks when new outage reports surface. Utilities repaired the cracked crossarm and replaced fuses that had tripped during the storm, then published a maintenance summary on their website. The summary listed the outage window within broader operations and mentioned no injuries recorded during the night of the disappearance. Families in the neighborhood saved copies of the page, and archived notes record residents arguing over the meaning of terse language. Investigators never confirmed any link between the maintenance summary and the case, and dispatch logs closed the thread without additional explanation. The mother kept working nights, reportedly moving to a different facility after winter gave way to an early break in ice. She told a counselor she avoided the alley and took a longer path around the block when errands required walking past the stairwell. Reese transferred to a different building, and the uncle changed shifts at the parts store, then stopped answering reporters who knocked. Some locals claimed these changes were meaningful, while neighbors said people adjust their routes when winter ends and work schedules shift. The county file from 2009 preserves both views without judgment, and investigators never confirmed that any adjustment held investigative weight. Years later, the duplex paint flaked in the same stairwell, and the door closer still dragged when the hallway cooled. A new tenant found a child's library card under the second step, then turned it over to a clerk downtown. The clerk checked the number and found the card expired before the outage, then wrote a note that attached to the record. Archived notes say the mother could not identify the card as her son's, and records conflict on the listed address. Investigators never confirmed a connection, though the discovery reopened conversations that move through Anchorage whenever lights flicker against winter clouds. The stories. This roadside photo changed the search in minutes. They called it a routine missing person search, and for most of that morning, it really felt like a routine search. A line of cars idled along a two-lane highway, and a handful of volunteers moved like slow clock hands through brush. Kira Duvall was 31, and she worked nights as a paramedic who could not stop reading maps. She took a personal day to help because she had patched hikers before, and she knew how fast heat turns hours cruel. Her plan for the day was simple and responsible, and it fit the tone of the briefing. She would work the southern fence line, check culverts, and log anything that looked out of place with a phone photo. The county sheriff had warned everyone about trespassing, and a deputy repeated the same rule in a firm voice. The missing man was named Owen Brackett, age 42, and he worked as a crane operator at a quarry north of town. Owen had left a garage sale with a box of tools, and a neighbor reportedly saw him turn toward the state highway. His sister filed a report after unanswered texts piled up overnight, and dispatch logs showed a welfare check on his small rental. He was not inside, and the bed was flat, and two mugs sat near a drying rack like small sentries. Kira walked that fence line with a volunteer named Bryn, who carried a bright orange notepad and a quiet focus. They talked little, and they moved in a steady pattern that felt almost like work at the station. The sun hummed through the haze, and cicadas made a loose electric sound over the ditch water. At 11, a deputy waved everyone toward the gravel pullout near the mile 11 marker sign. He wanted to regroup because the northern team had found a set of shoe prints near a culvert and needed space. Kira capped a water bottle, and Bryn checked the notepad, and they headed in with a slow trot. The meeting was short and clipped, and it held its shape like a sturdy box. The prints matched the size the sister described, and they angled toward a tree line that cut the field like a zipper. A drone team would scan the shadowed area, and everyone else would shift south by 2 miles and reset. Kira slid into her dusty sedan and checked her phone before moving, and that choice bent everything. A community page had started filling with posts, and a moderator had asked locals to send any roadside footage. One post sat near the top with a lot of comments, and the author had written a single line, "Is this him? Or am I seeing things?" The photo showed a shoulder of road near a farm stand, and a compact truck with a dented tailgate. A person stood beside it with a box in his arms, and the blur of the face did not help much. The timestamp showed yesterday at 4:12, and the location tag used a generic label. Bryn leaned in and squinted because the light was hard on the screen. Kira took a screenshot, then another, and she pinched the image until it turned blocky and awkward. The truck bed had two items that did not fit a garage sale box, and that was the first small tap on the door of her attention. One looked like a narrow metal rod wrapped in tape, and the other looked like a folded bag with a reflective stripe. The comments argued about whether it was Owen, and a few people mentioned a similar box. The moderator wrote that the photo had been sent in by a traveler passing through and that the original file was higher quality. Kira tried the contact button and sent a quick note with her name and the number on the volunteer badge. They drove south to the new grid, and the phone buzzed with a reply that carried a simple greeting. The traveler introduced himself as Linus, and he wrote that he had taken the photo for the farm stand sign. He said he was willing to share the full resolution image, and he attached it with a short, polite line. Kira opened the file, and the world shifted one notch toward clear. The folded bag was a safety triangle case, and the wrapped rod was a roadside jack handle with old tape. The truck had a sun-faded sticker for a fishing club 2 counties east, and a circle of mud on one tire suggested a recent dirt turnout. None of that made it Owen, and none of it placed him where the drone team worked hard. Then she saw the highway sign reflected in the farm stand glass, and the letters formed an odd mirror riddle. She rotated the phone and zoomed again, and the sign resolve clicked into place like a knot pulled tight. The number sequence matched a spur route that did not exist near the quarry or the culvert with the prints. Bryn watched her face and asked a question with no extra words. Kira answered in the same thin tone, and it sounded like two people trying not to scare a deer. The reflection showed spur 118, which only cut across the western ridge and met the old freight road near the radio towers. That was miles from the organized search, and it was the kind of road people use when they know it well. Kira called the staging number and asked for the sergeant who handled evidence intake at the pullout. She explained that a community submission included a reflection that might place the photo near the western ridge. The sergeant asked for the file, and she sent it, and then she sent a marked-up copy with a red circle around the reflection. Her voice felt steady but pointed, and she stayed inside the lanes of what volunteers were allowed to say. Dispatch called Linus to verify the time, and archived call notes later reportedly showed a clean match with his phone metadata. A deputy drove to the farm stand to confirm the angle, and his body cam captured the same letters when held at shoulder height. The sergeant asked the drone team to hold, and a small unit broke off toward the ridge with a calm, deliberate speed. Kira and Bryn reached the new grid and parked near a cattle gate that had a brown rope for a latch. The radio traffic shifted slowly, and it sounded like someone unfolding a map in a windless room. A second photo arrived from Linus, and it showed the farm stand chalkboard with a faint line of numbers written low. The numbers matched a delivery price list and the date, and a small logo that narrowed the stand to a single family. No private names made the air, and the unit handled it with care that felt almost like a quiet prayer. Kira received a thank you text and a note telling her to continue the assigned grid until instructed otherwise. She felt relief and restraint share one chair, and she went back to ditch water and briars and the chirr of cicadas. A call-out went to a tower contractor who reportedly kept a service log for access gates near the western ridge. He confirmed that a gate lock had been replaced 2 days earlier after being cut, and he sent a photo of the new brass shine. That photo sat next to Linus's image in the channel the sergeant used, and the pair looked like two buttons on a single coat. None of this guaranteed Owen had driven there, and the unit held the line on that sober point. Two residents near the spur told a deputy they had heard a truck with a loud belt late afternoon, and the detail matched the neighbor's note about Owen's squeal at idle. The deputy wrote that down as a witness statement, and he did not add any flourish beyond the time. A camera at a decommissioned way station still recorded to an old cloud account, and an archived clip reportedly captured the same dented tailgate. Kira thought about how people leave a breadcrumb trail even when they do not mean to leave anything. The farm stand glass, the chalkboard, the way station cloud, and the tower log drew a path that no single person owned. She worked her grid with a calm pace, and she answered Bryn's small questions with the patience of coworkers at a long shift. At 2:15, the radio clicked alive in a tone that set everyone breathing shallow for a moment. A unit had found a compact truck pulled off on a shelf road below the western ridge, and the plate matched Owen's registration. The truck sat at an angle with two wheels and scrub, and the safety triangle case was open near the bumper. A box of tools rested on the passenger seat with a folded receipt that listed sockets and a tape measure. They did not broadcast names, and they did not describe medical conditions over the air. The sergeant used a spare line to request medical support that fit a non-emergent transport. A paramedic unit rolled in from a highway turnaround, and Kira watched the dust rising from miles away like a signal made of powder. Hours later, an official note stated that Owen had been found alert and dehydrated and that he had messaged family. The truck had a failed fuel pump and a dying belt, and he had tried to flag help before climbing for better reception. He slipped on loose gravel by the cut and decided to wait, and his phone battery gave up near sunset. He stayed close to the truck, and he drank the bottled water from the garage sale box that had sounded so ordinary. The investigation continued in the tidy way that follows relief, and it collected details that felt useful but unglamorous. The farm stand owner confirmed the timestamp on the chalkboard through a drawer receipt that matched the hour of the photo. The tower contractor saved his gate log for the file, and the waystation clip was downloaded before the old cloud account could rotate storage. Nothing in those artifacts turned dramatic, and all of it built a single sturdy ladder that reached the shelf road. Kira went home after handing over her notes and a neatly labeled folder of images. She sat at her kitchen table and felt the quiet ring in her bones, like something that wanted a name. The day had not been lucky, and it had not been heroic, and it had not been cinematic either. It had been a long, tight weave of small, precise things that met each other at perfect corners. She texted Bryn a simple line and thanked her for the careful walking and the steadiness. Bryn replied with an emoji, then caught herself and sent plain words that matched the briefing rules. She wrote that the photo had been the hinge, and that Kira had noticed the hinge before anyone else did. Kira answered with a line that cut the praise in half and kept the useful part. A week later, a brief statement appeared on the county site and did not mention volunteers by name. It thanked a traveling witness who had shared a clear image, and it thanked locals who stayed off the ridge during the search. It emphasized the value of precise information, and it asked the same thing people always get asked when time turns cruel. Share what you see, and do not guess more than the picture allows. Kira read it during a station break and thought about the reflection in the farm stand glass. She thought about how often truth hides in edges and mirrors, and how a mile marker can sit inside a pane like a secret. She filed the day under a private label and promised herself to keep looking for letters where letters should not be. That promise felt like a job that anyone could do, and also like a job that some people never think to try. When people later asked about the moment that moved the search, the answer sounded almost too small. A traveler took a picture of a sign, and a volunteer noticed the wrong route in the reflection, and a team shifted. The story made no room for grand statements, and it did not need a raised voice or a perfect ending. It needed an image, a circle of red pixels, and a ridge road where a truck sat angled like a held breath. Owen went back to his routine, and a friend reportedly drove him to a mechanic who understood old belts. He brought a pie to the farm stand as a thank you, and he kept his name off any posts that asked for a retelling. The family put the box of tools back on a garage shelf, and the receipt curled into a corner like a tidy leaf. His sister changed his phone charger for a tougher cable, and she set an alert for check-ins that would not nag. Kira kept working nights, and she drew grids in her head while folding gauze or checking vitals and stoplights. She believed in documents, and she believed in witnesses, and she believed in plain, ordinary pictures that steal a detail. She did not frame it as fate, and she did not call it anything with a shine. She called it paying attention, and she let the phrase sit like a low, steady light behind her ribs. Some stories end with a headline, and some stories end with a sentence that barely dents the air. This one ended with a screenshot, a small glass reflection, and a map where a wrong turn finally made sense. The title that made the rounds sounded dramatic, and the truth behind it stayed comfortably simple. A roadside photo changed the search in minutes because someone looked twice and then told the right person fast. The stories. Paramedic who kept one final snapshot. The story began with a photo that shouldn't have existed. A single Polaroid, slightly overexposed, showing the inside of an ambulance during a call that supposedly never happened. It was discovered years later, tucked between the pages of an old medical manual in a small town fire station's archive. The man behind that photo was Martin Kessler, a 42-year-old paramedic who'd spent nearly 2 decades working in a quiet coastal county. He was the kind of person people trusted instantly: steady hands, calm voice, always first on scene and last to leave. Colleagues said he never forgot a face, even from calls years earlier. That photographic memory made the irony of what happened next impossible to ignore. In late March of 2012, Martin and his partner, Dana Ruiz, responded to a dispatch from a stretch of highway north of town. A rollover accident, single vehicle, one driver, reportedly conscious but trapped. The log shows they arrived at 2:17 a.m. Weather clear, visibility decent. Everything about the report was ordinary. Until it wasn't. When firefighters reached the car, there was no one inside. Seatbelt unbuckled, airbags deployed, engine still ticking from heat, no footprints in the gravel shoulder, no sign of struggle. Dana's field notes mention Martin standing there longer than anyone, staring into the dark beyond the guardrail, as if waiting for something to move. He didn't say much on the drive back, just, "It doesn't feel right. Someone was here." The next morning, Martin called the dispatcher, asking for the driver's name. There wasn't one. The system had registered the call as civilian report unknown source. No 911 record existed, only a radio relay from a patrol unit that later denied making it. That was when Martin started keeping a notebook, part medical log, part journal. He filled it with incident details that didn't make sense, addresses that didn't appear on maps, names that changed between shift reports, an emergency call from a decommissioned nursing home that had burned down 5 years earlier. Dana joked it was his ghost file, but Martin treated it like evidence. In mid-April, station archives show him requesting a portable camera from inventory, the kind still used for accident documentation. He said he wanted backups for reports. No one questioned it. That camera became the source of the one photo that remains. On May 5th, Martin responded alone to a cardiac distress call in a residential neighborhood. The official dispatch recorded a woman named Eleanor Marsh, age 71. When Dana arrived 15 minutes later, the house was empty. No patient, no signs of struggle, only Martin sitting on the front steps, shaking. He told her he'd just finished chest compressions, but there was no body. That evening, he turned in a sealed envelope to the station chief. Inside, a single Polaroid showing an elderly woman on a stretcher inside the ambulance. Her face pale but peaceful, IV line in her arm, heart monitor reading a steady rhythm. The timestamp on the photo matched the call, yet no hospital in the region logged a patient by that name, and the ambulance's GPS data placed it in the station lot at the time. For weeks, the department treated it as a data glitch, a wrong timestamp, maybe a mistaken upload. Martin, however, stopped taking calls entirely. He used his accumulated leave and disappeared from the rotation. Dana later said he'd started visiting the county records office, spending hours looking through missing persons reports from the 1990s onward. According to the clerk's statement, he requested files on one case repeatedly: a local woman, 71 years old, who'd vanished from her home in May of 1996. Her name, Eleanor Marsh. She'd been last seen the same week a younger Martin had begun his EMT training in that same county. What tied them together came from an old photograph Martin found in the file. It showed a group of EMT trainees standing beside a vintage ambulance. On the far left, a younger Martin smiling awkwardly. On the far right, a woman in a white nurse's uniform, Eleanor, back when she'd volunteered with the training program. Her sudden disappearance had never been solved. The case quietly closed after 3 years. The evidence stacking grew stranger. In late May, an internal audit found Martin had accessed archived radio frequencies from the old dispatch system equipment retired in 1999. He'd been trying to trace the source of that first mysterious accident call. Logs showed someone or something still transmitting on that outdated frequency once every few nights, always repeating the same brief phrase, "medic en route." By early June, Martin returned to work briefly, though he looked exhausted, his once steady hands trembling. He told Dana he thought the woman from the Polaroid had been trying to reach him for years, that all the phantom calls were echoes of old emergencies, looping through time until someone finally answered. She begged him to take time off again, but he refused. "If I stop listening," he said, "they'll stop trying to come home." The last confirmed sighting of Martin Kessler was on June 15th of that year. Surveillance footage from a rural gas station shows him fueling the ambulance alone, headlights off, before driving north toward the old highway. The timestamp reads 2:17 a.m., the exact minute of the original rollover call. 3 days later, the ambulance was found parked beside a defunct rest stop, keys still in the ignition. The driver's side door was open, the radio turned to static. In the back compartment, responders discovered a single Polaroid camera lying on the gurney. It contained one undeveloped sheet of film. That image was later processed by the state lab. It showed the inside of the ambulance, empty except for a stretcher, with two folded paramedic jackets placed neatly side by side. The back doors stood open, facing a foggy stretch of road. The official report labeled Martin Kessler missing, presumed deceased. No further transmissions were logged from the old frequency. The firehouse quietly retired his call sign, and the Polaroid was sealed in evidence storage, tagged simply, "Recovered from Unit 7, June 15, 2012. Years later, when new recruits asked about him, veterans would point to the framed photo on the wall, the one of Martin and Dana receiving their service award in 2010. Behind the glass, barely visible under the reflection of overhead lights, there's a faint double exposure. The outline of an ambulance interior, doors open, a stretcher waiting. At this point, the facts that remained were simple. The snapshot was real, the patient never existed, and somewhere along that forgotten highway, a paramedic might have finally answered a call meant only for him. The stories. This highway turnout kept a secret roadside ledger. The turnout sat 3 miles past the hill crest, where the shoulder widened and an old guardrail curled around scrub pines. It looked like any layover patch on a western freight route, wind-scoured and sun-bleached, the kind of place drivers used when the low gear cooked too hot. Ivo Calderon was 34 and worked highway maintenance out of a county yard near a small valley town. He had the steady patience of someone who counted reflectors at dawn, and he kept a pocket notebook for bolts that liked to work loose. He planned a simple loop that Tuesday: swap a cracked mile marker, replace a dented sign, check the culvert at the turnout. He pulled the county pickup beside the rail and killed the engine, and the quiet after the fan belt felt too clean. He had heard drivers call the turnout a good place to let brakes breathe, and earlier dispatch chatter mentioned a stalled sedan reported before sunrise. The sedan was gone now, but a dark rectangle pressed into gravel showed where tires had slept. He walked the rail, tapped bolts with a wrench, and found a new scar where the metal had curled inward like a knuckle. He crouched to look for glass or plastic, and his fingers met tin. The box felt cold despite the heat, wedged under the rail post with 2 flat rocks bracing it tight. He checked for snakes first, then slid it out with a sand scuff. Inside was a ledger wrapped in a cut trash bag, bound with string, edges rubbed thin as old denim. On the first page, someone had printed "Mile 37 turnout, keep it dry, return it where you found it." The handwriting was neat, each line pressed with a heavy hand that understood trucks and weather. The early entries read like a log of small trades, which made sense in that place and on that road. Diesel siphoned and replaced with cash, jump starts marked with initials, spare brake light bulbs counted like borrowed pencils. The dates were written carefully as words, like 2019 and 2020, and then the numbers stopped for a while when the world went strange. He flipped to a recent page and noticed a different style, lighter ink and quicker strokes that curled on the downstroke. It said, "Skimmer crew parked by mile 32 according to a driver. Call the county before you accept a tow." Another said, "Gray sedan with a trailer ball gave bottles and left at dawn. Check camera near the crest for plate." He looked at the tin again and found a folded slip beneath the ledger that smelled like lemon cleaner. Someone had written, "If you find this and you work the road, please look at dispatch logs from last winter." He recognized the phrasing and the gentle push, not a demand, more like a tired neighbor asking you to look through a fence. He set the ledger back in the tin, snapped a quick photo for memory, and secured the box the way he had found it. The air felt still, and a low thunder came from the downshift of a distant semi that needed the long lane more than talk. He got in the truck, scratched a date in his pocket notebook, and drove back toward the yard with the uneasy feeling of stepping on a path with fresh footprints. In the office after lunch, he pulled archived calls on the shared computer, which the crew used for storm maps and shift swap. The log from late winter listed a cluster of calls around mile 30, with drivers reporting a two-truck team that arrived fast and unasked. One entry used the word predatory, which was rare in casual notes, and another mentioned cash prices on a scrap of paper. He kept reading and saw a note from a county deputy about skimmers on card readers at a nearby fuel plaza. That plaza sat between the crest and the river bridge, where drivers liked to grab coffee and plug in sleepers to keep a steady chill. He printed the page, then printed the call clusters, and wrote the turnout mile in the margins because he trusted his own ink. The next morning, he returned to the route early, with a thermos and a camera that clipped to the dash like a square eye. He planned to change a reflector near the crest and let the camera watch the turnout. Nothing secret, just habit dressed as curiosity. The road held a thin fog that looked like breath on glass, and the pines below the rail felt damp enough to keep a secret. He parked, waited a few minutes, and watched a box truck pull in slow with brakes sighing like someone settling into a couch. A woman climbed out, mid-40s, hair tied back, shoulders set like someone who carried more than straps and ratchets. She checked her wheels, knocked her lugs with a bar, then walked to the guardrail with a mason jar wrapped in a towel. She crouched where the tin lived, did not look around, and worked like a person who practiced in silence and noticed the small things. She took the ledger out, slid in the folded towel, wrote 3 lines, then added a smaller page clipped by a binder clip that made a sharp click. He felt guilty watching and looked down to pretend his coffee needed attention, which it did not, but pretend worked anyway. He waited until she left, then pretended to check the culvert again, this time with a small shovel that made the roll feel official. He eased the tin out, opened the ledger to the fresh page, and read a tidy note that felt like a breadcrumb. It said, "Tow crew again, near mile 32 last night, reportedly told a young driver they worked with the county." Another line said, "I am leaving 4 bottles of coolant and a bag of rags for anyone stuck with a pinhole." He wrote a line himself, kept to the ledger tone, and made sure the ink did not bleed through on the thin paper. He wrote, "County maintenance checked the turnout, no affiliation with tow crews, call dispatch if pressured." He tucked his page under the binder clip and slid everything back, angling the rocks to wedge firm because small rituals matter when the wind gets ideas. He drove to the fuel plaza later that morning, the one near the bridge where the skimmers had allegedly lived, and asked around. The cashier, a young guy with a careful haircut, said a retired radio operator sometimes handed out paper maps to drivers who looked lost. Reportedly, he kept notes on who needed help and who pushed scams, and he liked the old ways more than the new screens. The cashier said, "You want Arlene, not me," and pointed at the small sandwich counter where a woman was sorting bread with clean hands. Arlene had the posture of someone who had stood for decades without complaint, and her eyes moved fast like she listened with more than ears. She listened to Ivo explain his job and his curiosity, then nodded once like a shop teacher hearing a decent plan. She said, "There is a book, but we do not write full names because we do not want fights here." She said, "Some truckers leave notes about who helped, and sometimes they warn about boys who show up too fast with chains." She added, "A retired dispatcher named Theo started it after 2014 when the corner got tricky, and people forgot how to flag without yelling." Ivo asked if anyone had brought up mile 32 in the last month, and she looked past him like she was reading a chalkboard on a far wall. She said, "A kid in a small coupe said 2 trucks boxed him at night and tried to sell a winch like a miracle." She said the kid left when another driver pulled behind him with hazards blinking, which often makes a different kind of math happen. He thanked her and bought a sandwich he had not planned to buy, then sat in his truck and wrote lines in his pocket notebook. He marked the phrases retired dispatcher, ledger, tow scam, and noted that older hands tend to leave cleaner trails than noisy crews. He waited for his coffee to cool, then called the deputy listed on the winter logs and left a message saying he was checking a few things near the crest. The deputy called back that afternoon, voice calm, words clipped like someone who learned to talk over traffic noise. The deputy said there had been several reports of quick tow teams and a few complaints about skimmers, but nothing firm enough for a charge. He added that a neighbor near the climb heard engines idling around midnight often, and his dog growled the way dogs do when a rhythm is wrong. Ivo returned to the turnout at dusk with a reflective vest and a flashlight because nothing good happens when you pretend the dark is friendly. He checked the tin and found another page, this one printed with careful block letters like a patient teacher. It said, "If you need to know, check the gate camera on the service road above the crest and ask for last January." He knew the service road, a narrow cut that served a radio tower, and a wind monitor the county refused to replace. The gate had an old camera that fed a shared system, which logged plates and headlights more than faces and worked better than anyone expected. He sent a request through the county portal and asked for January footage from late night hours, and the reply came with a link and a warning about file size. He watched the clips after dinner on the break room monitor because the screen at home had a cracked corner he never fixed. In one clip, the turnout sat dark and empty until a pair of flatbeds eased in like wolves that knew the fence lines. Minutes later, a small hatchback rolled to a stop, hazard lights pulsing a tired heartbeat, and the flatbeds moved as if pulled by the same string. He watched the first driver step out and talk with quick hands, then watched the second driver circle the hatchback like it had a scent. A third vehicle pulled in and stopped behind the hatchback, a high sleeper with long antenna wires and an American flag sticker on the lower door. The hatchback backed away slow, then faster, and left the turnout with the sleeper following, which made the flatbeds idle in place. Next, he watched late January. And this clip hurt because the rain made everything shine like a wet stage where actors forgot their lines. A refrigerated trailer pulled in with smoke from one wheel, a soft gray that looked almost polite until it thickened at the edges. Within minutes, two figures worked the hub, one with a small extinguisher, one holding a flashlight, steady and calm, even as the smoke turned rude. The next page of the ledger joined the footage in his mind and made something click that felt like a seatbelt slipping into place. The page listed a night where a driver named Ash met a retired radio man who carried a milk crate of fuses and flagged traffic by feel. It said Ash made it to the next exit and left a case of water behind the rail as thanks, and the radio man refused cash with a stubborn grin. He started to suspect the ledger was not only a list of favors or warnings, but a quiet schedule for kindness that traveled under the grid. The binder clips held more than paper, they held little runs of trust, and a handful of people had decided the turnout would be a tiny town square. He still had to connect the tow crews to something more firm, or at least line up a clean path between names and nights. He reviewed the January footage again, then compared timestamps against dispatch logs, and found a gap where a call had been recorded but then labeled incomplete. The call preview mentioned a shaky voice saying 2 trucks had blocked a lane near mile 32, and another voice saying help was already on the way. The logs showed no county units listed, and the note ended with line dropped, likely lost signal. He printed the clip stills and wrote notes by hand, careful to keep letters large and unhurried because speed ruined more ink than rain. He visited the plaza again and asked Arlene if she knew a retired radio man named Theo, which made her mouth twitch like a bad joke arrived late. She said Theo still came in on Thursdays to trade old surplus radios for stories he liked better than the radios themselves. On Thursday, she waved Ivo to a small table near the window where a thin man sat with a canvas cap and a careful breath. Theo looked at the stills without touching them and asked easy questions about wind direction and how long the trucks had stayed put. He read the ledger note photocopy and raised one eyebrow at the refund line where someone had scratched out an unkind word. Theo said, "That book started when we lost a pullout after a washout in 2014 and needed somewhere to map goodwill." He said, "We kept names light on purpose. No addresses, no hero stories, just notes that kept people honest enough to look in the mirror." He added, "I have reported the crews twice with plates, but the plates led to a rental maze that likes to erase footprints." Ivo asked if Theo would mind adding a line that county maintenance knew the ledger existed, and Theo nodded once like a metronome. He wrote in a tight script, "County eyes know this book and prefer its honesty, no affiliation with any tow company." He slid the pen back with 2 fingers, then told a quick story about a snow chain locker that used to freeze shut and how a hammer can respect stubborn metal without breaking it. The next week, Ivo placed a small metal cabinet behind the rail, painted brown like the dirt, no markings, no lock, just a storm latch. Inside, he put rags, coolant, a cheap inflator, and a folded card that said, "Call dispatch and wait if anyone pressures you about towing." The ledger went into the cabinet with its tin, and a note asked writers to close the latch because the wind enjoyed rude jokes. Word spread in the slow way good habits move when they do not ask for attention or applause. Drivers left cleaner notes with times and directions that avoided names, and one traveler wrote a careful line about a black dog that lay near the rail at night to watch tires pass like planets. A deputy added, quietly and without badge number, that a new camera watched the mile 32 shoulder from an angle the crews did not expect. In early summer, a box truck driver named Kelda wrote about a man who flagged her down and pointed to a soft tire, then asked for cash. She wrote, "I offered water and a phone call, and he left without names," and a second car watched from the shadow near the sign. 2 days later, someone wrote, "Gray sedan again, park lights off, backed away when 2 vehicles pulled in together. Report filed at the substation." The plaza cashier taped a simple note near the register that said, "Tow authorization is free by county phone. Ask before you pay anyone." The retired radio man drew a small map to the turnout for a college kid hauling a couch and told him to rest his brakes in the shade because patience kept families alive. The kid returned a week later and left a bag of chips and a soft drink in the cabinet with a note that said, "Thanks for the air." Ivo felt the road change by inches, the way a river shifts after a downed tree moves just enough to stop a hidden whirl. He still checked bolts and reflectors, he still swept glass after fender kisses, he still logged storms the way farmers count clouds. He also read the ledger when the latch stuck, and he understood that small tools, shared quietly, can be stronger than loud plants. In late summer, a line appeared in a new hand, careful and slow, as if the writer wanted the words to stand up straight. It said, "2 trucks tried a price on a young couple in a silver van near mile 32 last night. Another driver blocked and called." It ended, deputies arrived, reportedly took reports, crews left before plates could be confirmed, camera angle improved view. Ivo printed that line for the deputy and handed over the catalyst chain he had assembled, which was not a case file, just a path. The deputy said thanks without a smile, and later called to say a larger investigation had opened that spanned beyond their stretch of quiet hills. He did not ask for the ledger, and he did not tell Ivo to stop watching. He only asked that the book stay clean of full names to protect decent people. The turnout kept breathing in its slow way, heat riding off gravel in visible waves that made everything wobble and dreamlike. The ledger pages grew soft at the corners, and someone glued reinforced strips to the spine with care that matched the first handwriting. Now and then, a new driver wrote a sentence that sounded grateful for a simple jug of water left by a stranger with a pencil. A local professor left a note about starting a small roadside history project and asked if anyone minded a photocopy at the library. Theo wrote yes, but keep the copy without names, use dates written as words, and call it the Mile 37 book. The library later displayed a scan that showed a landscape of small trades and warnings, nothing dramatic, just a community stitched by traffic and time. Ivo stopped keeping his own separate notes once the system felt stable enough to grow without him tugging at every thread. He still checked the cabinet latch, still wiped dust off the tin, still tightened bolts with gloves that smelled like oil. And Sunday, he understood the ledger worked because it was specific but humble, and because no one wanted ownership beyond a steady line and clear daylight. When the wind came down from the ridge and the pines whispered like a big crowd that agreed on the same joke, the turnout looked ordinary. It still hid a storage of rags and coolant. It still held a book with entries written in hands that learned patience from asphalt. It still sat 3 miles past the crest, where trucks let their brakes breathe, and people learned to slow down enough to see one another. He remembered the first time he had levered the tin from the dust, felt the weight of words that did not need a speech. He thought about the winter calls, the quick hands at the hub, the quiet driver who blocked a box and made the math different. He thought about how a secret can be a responsibility more than a thrill, and how some secrets work best when shared carefully and left mostly unremarked. Arlene kept handing out maps and sandwiches, the cashier kept teasing drivers about their sweet tooth, and Theo kept trading radios for stories he liked better. The deputy kept watching Mile 32 from an angle that made crews uncomfortable, and the plaza lights kept throwing a honey glow across damp pavement after late rain. The road kept moving people who carried every kind of trouble and hope inside their glove boxes and on their dashboards. The ledger held a few blank pages that looked like future mornings and late nights, and the latch kept closing with a soft click. Travelers kept adding lines that sounded like a handshake, and the turnout kept holding small proof that strangers can decide to be neighbors. The book did not stop every scheme, but it hurt the margins enough that different plans made more sense than the old fast money ones. Ivo still checked the culvert after storms, still measured sediment against last season, still logged a snake sighting when a thicket rattled like loose change. He knew the ledger would change hands again eventually, not because he wanted it, but because the road decides and the people follow. He trained a new hire to watch for bolts that work loose and told him that some fixes start with a pencil and a jar. If anyone asked why the turnout mattered, he would point to the cabinet and the scrub pines and the clean lines of the rail. He would say that a book of simple favors became a ledger of safety, and that safety looked ordinary until you added up the lines. He would not mention names, and he would not tell a single hero story, because none of it needed that kind of shine. The highway kept its stubborn rhythm, and the ledger kept its quiet balance, and both felt honest in a way that made sense. The secret was not really a secret anymore, not to the people who needed it and respected what it asked. It asked for neat lines, shared tools, clear times, and the courage to arrive with hazards on and no need for applause.